Hello friends, I made a pattern to make little doll cardigans from human socks. If you want the pattern for this, check out my Etsy. It's available for free for my $5 tier patrons, or message me on Instagram and I can get you the pattern. There's two different size patterns. These are both the slimline, but there's also a pattern for an oversized cardigan. The construction's the same, but the outcome is a little bit different. So I'm going to show you how I put that together. When you're printing out your pattern, make sure that you check the scale first. This is super important. If these aren't the right size, that means the pattern pieces won't be the right size. When you're printing it out, make sure that you're printing it at 100% and not scaling to fit. So then I'm going to cut out the pieces for the slimline cardigan. So that's the slimline front, the back, one sleeve, the collar and cuff piece and the hems. So I'm using some men's socks here. If you use a bigger sock, then you can get one cardigan out of one sock, but if you have like a pattern on the socks, then you might need to use two just to like kind of harvest the fabric from them. I don't know why I unpicked the rib like this. You can just cut it off and it like unpicks it itself, but yeah, so take the rib off because we're going to use that for the hem and the collar and cuffs. For the little pink one that I showed you before, that didn't have a long hem on it, so I ended up using just like the regular fabric from the sock. I'm using the rib because it gives a different effect. I think it looks quite nice. Not all socks are like this, obviously, so like how you cut your pattern might be a little bit different from this. I'm then going to kind of like break down the sock into more manageable pieces. Does that make sense? I'm taking out the heel part because I don't want that. It's kind of like because it doesn't lay flat basically. And I'm also going to take the toe out. Don't worry about this fraying, it's a knit, they don't tend to fray too badly. I don't want that whatever, I don't want that basically, so I'm cutting that right on the edge so it's not in the middle of my piece of fabric. And then I'm just going to check how the pieces will fit, so I'll need two fronts, one as it is and one with the piece the other way up, like mirrored, two sleeves, two cuff pieces, one collar and one hem. The cuff and collar are a little bit flexible, so I'll talk about that in a minute. I'm just checking how these fit. I want to make sure that the like arrows are going long ways, so knit has this like arrow pattern on it if you look at it really closely, and I need the arrows to be like pointing with the grain of the fabric with the length of the pattern piece. This means that the stretchier way is going to be around the width of the garment. I'm going to pin lots and then just cut that out. When I'm cutting, I try and leave the pattern piece on the piece I've cut, just then I know what I've cut and what it is. It makes it a bit easier. So that's my right way up front piece, and then I'm going to cut it again upside down, so this way I've got the two mirrored pieces because these are on the front. You don't want two of the same, and there is a right and a wrong side to this. I cut this one upside down. I don't know if it makes a difference, to be honest, and I think because it's such a small scale we can't really notice it. So with this one, cut the hem the right size and then cut the collar the right size, and then I realised that actually for the cuffs I'm going to have a little bit less fabric. This is okay, the cuff piece is too big anyway. So then we're going to put the pieces together like this. That dark purple one is the mirrored one. At the beginning and end of each row of stitching, I'm going to do back stitches. This will make sure to anchor our line of stitching and make sure that it doesn't gather or pull loose, because we are going to have to kind of yank on this fabric a fair bit when we're putting in the collar and the hems. And I'm using a walking foot. I tend to with stretches because it means that it will feed evenly through the machine and won't kind of like overstretch the fabric as I'm sewing. I tend to use the buttons on my machine. I just find this easier to control. I'm using quite a short stitch length here though. This project is sewable by hand. I would use a running stitch or a running back stitch to put it together. So we're going to put it together in this cross shape. Make sure you really double check with these front pieces. With this sock it's quite obvious which the right and the wrong side is, so make sure you're putting right sides together and you've got that diagonal at the bottom and there's kind of a little flat bit at the top. That's just to allow for the seam allowance. I know that diagonal at the front is kind of strange, but don't worry about it, it will have a flat hem. It just needed to be this shape to hang evenly all the way around. But yeah, take your time with this part, double check, because like literally I've made this pattern about 8 times trying to figure out the best construction and I got it wrong. It was, like literally with this sock I had to remake it with the other purple sock. So this is the shape that we should be left with. Make sure we've got those diagonal bits at the bottom, just double check. And so this is the inside. Those seam allowances we don't need, so I'm going to trim them super close. Be very careful, don't cut that stitch line, but trim it real close. This is going to help your cardigan look a lot neater from the inside. Maybe take the time to trim those threads here as well. I always try and trim my threads as I go. I don't always do it, but otherwise I end up with just like a pile of threads at the end and it's just a nightmare to then go back and trim those. So I'm leaving a little bit of that seam allowance at the edges rather than trimming all the way up. We don't need it, don't worry. It's okay if you trim it all the way. So if you've backstitched at the beginning and edge of each row of stitching, which I completely recommend rather than knotting, then pulling that shouldn't be an issue. We're now going to add the collar. This was the way that I found easiest to construct this. It might be a little bit different for you, do what's easiest, but this is what I'm going to do. So this is the slightly longer piece of ribbing. This is the collar, which is obviously curved, but I'm kind of pulling it and manipulating it to be flat just to put this flat piece of ribbing in. So I'm going to pin either end first, right sides together, double check right sides together, and then I'm going to stretch and pin the middle section. Take your time with this, do stretch it, pin a lot, because otherwise you can kind of get it a little bit tangled and bunched and then the neckline won't lie flat. So the seam allowance on this part is actually going to be a whole centimetre. So the rest of it we've done 5mm, this one's a whole centimetre. You could actually adjust this if you wanted like a higher or lower neckline, but whole centimetre for it to look like this cardigan. Seriously, take your time with the pinning, repin if you need to. Back stitch at the beginning and end, go slow, make sure to manipulate the fabric through, and keep an eye on this, make sure it's not bunching. I've got the rib on the back because the pieces that we've sewn together already are going to be the problematic part. The rib will kind of take care of itself, but make sure that you're pulling to get that stitch in properly. If you're a bit worried about catching the other pieces and not having the collar lay flat, do this line of stitches by hand. I'm gently pulling everything at the front with that left hand right now, helping it to lay flat, but also helping to stretch out both of the fabrics. Back stitch at the end of the line of stitches as well there. There we go, let's sew together. I'm trimming that seam allowance down now to about 2 millimeters. Be very, very careful not to clip that line of stitches though. We're going to encase that seam and finish off the collar by folding that in and then over. Pin a billion, pin so much here. I'm going to do both ends first and then deal with the middle. I'm trimming off that end as well, just so that the collar won't be bulky, because a lot of this is going to be hidden inside the collar. That's one of the reasons we needed to take this seam down. You could leave the other seams, the ones that I trimmed before, but this one, if you leave the seam, it will give a different look. This is to have quite a slim collar. If you wanted a bigger collar, you could leave it. So then again, I'm stretching and pinning. Lots of pins. Okay, so we're going to stitch in the ditch. This is a technique that will give you a hidden line of stitches. So literally inside that seam that you can see, that's where we're putting the line of stitches. If you're worried about this, do it by hand. It's a lot easier to see it then. Go slow. You actually don't even need to do it like this if you don't mind the line of stitches, but to kind of keep the illusion that this is a knitted garment, I'm doing stitch in the ditch. That's literally what the technique is called, so if you're struggling, Google stitch in the ditch. On my machine, I actually find it easier to do this with the needle in the center point. I tend to sew with it in the left hand position, but for stitch in the ditch, I find I get better visibility if I put it in the middle position. I am back stitching here. It's probably not the best idea. It's a little bit harder to see, but yeah, mostly I did okay. I'm not the greatest at stitching in the ditch. So then we're going to trim off all of that extra at the back. Again, super, super close. And out of frame. So that's our collar. We're going to add our cuff pieces, so the sleeves. Make sure you check that these are the sleeve pieces. Right at the end, we're just going to gather those down. So I'm hand stitching a running stitch here. I didn't want to put it through my machine because the stitches can get a bit tangled in the knit fabric sometimes. So just by hand, I'm sewing that running stitch, and then I'm going to pull it to gather it down to about 3 centimeters. So this was why we didn't need such a big cuff piece, because we're gathering down anyway. And then I am going to put a back stitch in there to hold that gather where it is. Tell a lie, I put a knot. So then we're going to add the sleeve cuff in a very similar way that we did the collar. We don't need to pull and stretch the sleeve piece here, just pin it straight on. And then we're using a 5mm seam allowance again. That's where I realised I still was in the centre position, so I'm going back to the left position. Out of frame, brilliant. Back in frame. Okay, so that's the cuff piece sewn on. I'm going to trim this again the same way that I did the collar. Be careful not to clip the line of stitches like I did. Don't be like me. I kind of like wrangled it back in there. It's fixable. Just try. Do your best. So then we're folding over, pinning again and stitching in the ditch again the same way we did with the collar. I'm leaving this cuff a little bit longer. The collar, I think we only did about 2mm. This one I'm going for about 5. Totally up to you, longer, shorter, whatever. You do you, boo. Again, I'm just going to trim off that extra. And then do exactly the same on the other side. Sorry about the desk chaos. I felt like I didn't show this very well, so we're going to sew down the length of the sleeve. So with the right side facing you, we're just folding it in half down the line of the sleeve and then matching up those edges, pinning lavishly, and then we're going to sew the whole length of the side seam. And again, we're trimming off that seam allowance. But Lee, why don't you just make your pattern smaller and then you won't have to trim it? Because I hate when my machine eats the clothes I'm making, and I found that if the seam allowance is bigger, it won't do this. If you want to sew it with a smaller seam allowance, just redraw the seam allowance on the pattern. I wouldn't recommend it. I really don't like sewing with a tiny seam allowance. So now we're going to put the hem on. I'm actually gathering down a little bit to put the hem on. You could run a gathering stitch through this if you wanted to. I don't find it necessary. I'm just going to pin those gathers in, just like pin it down a bit smaller. Again, pinning both of the ends and then just kind of bunching it up a little bit as I go along. I'm so sorry for the chaos on my desk. Seriously, the first time I made it, kept my desk beautiful. You can see her in the back on Frankie. She's already wearing the wonky one I made, but then when I was doing the second one, I just could not keep on top of the desk. I'm so sorry. So I'm pinning the middle first just to kind of try and make it more even. And I know I want more gathers in the back, so I'm putting the majority of those like pinchy gathers in the back. And then sewing the same as the other hem pieces that we've added. I'm using a 5 millimeter seam allowance for this again. Trimming that seam allowance down again. We're sewing this bottom hem the same way that we did the collar. I didn't show it very well, so I did some illustrations again. But yeah, it's exactly the same way as we did the collar, however a little bit longer in the same way that we did the cuffs. And again, we're stitching in the ditch. And then I'm trimming down the extra in the same way I trimmed down everything else. This is actually all the sewing I'm going to do for this piece. I found that the front hems on this one rolled in fine. In the one I did for the cottagecore, it wasn't the same situation, so I actually added a facing with a cotton fabric. So if you're finding that the front hems are not rolling in, then you might want to do an invisible stitch to hold those down, or even just like a straight running stitch if you don't mind it being visible. So I'm turning it right way out. Personally, I didn't find any of the visible seams inside this cardigan to be a problem. If you did, you might want to cover it with ribbon. I would probably glue it to avoid having visible stitches on the outside. Totally up to you though. So trimming all those extra threads as well. I had a little bit of an issue at the collar with it not lying how I wanted to, so what I'm doing is just like hand sewing that hem down, doing overcast stitches. So kind of like a whip stitch really, but not really sewing things together, just sewing over itself, like kind of enclosing that unruly hem in some stitches. So I hope you like the pattern. If you make this, tag me on everything. I want to see, especially if you have trouble getting contact, and we'll troubleshoot the issues. Yeah, I think it's pretty cute. I'll be making another tutorial about how to work with kind of like different socks with patterns or pictures on, just for like kind of harvesting the material and where to put your pieces. So yeah, thanks again for watching. Thanks always for your support, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.